A shocking daylight murder has rocked a residential complex in Anchorage. A property manager was shot dead at his workplace after a dispute over evictions. Horrifying details of the crime, which was the result of unbridled anger and desperation, have been revealed in court. In the quiet residential area of Anchorage, Alaska, a tragic and unsettling event unfolded that would leave an indelible mark on the local community. On a seemingly ordinary day, what began as a routine landlord-tenant interaction spiraled into a deadly confrontation. The victim, Chad Staley, a property manager with years of experience, arrived at the apartment complex to carry out what he expected would be a standard eviction notice. Unbeknownst to him, he would never leave the premises alive. According to witnesses and evidence presented during the trial, Chad had made several attempts over the preceding months to address a long-standing tenancy issue involving a man named Mitchell Glenn. Glenn had lived in the complex with his partner, who was the official leaseholder. When the couple's relationship ended and the partner moved out, Glenn was no longer authorized to remain in the unit. Despite repeated notices and legal warnings, he refused to vacate the premises. On the day of the incident, Staley arrived with an employee to assess the unit and follow up on previous eviction proceedings. Glenn, however, had already begun preparing for a confrontation. Testimony later revealed that he had a history of animosity toward the property manager and was deeply resentful of what he perceived as harassment.
My fear was that he's going to notice that I'm still here in the office and that he was going to come for me.
In reality, Staley was simply fulfilling the duties of his job, duties that would, tragically, cost him his life. The confrontation began when Staley and his colleague approached the unit. Glenn emerged from the apartment visibly agitated. What followed was a brief but heated exchange, during which Glenn produced a handgun and, without warning, opened fire. Staley was struck multiple times. Despite attempts by his colleague to render aid and call for emergency services, Chad succumbed to his injuries before help could arrive. The scene that first responders encountered was harrowing. The body of a man dedicated to his work lay lifeless outside the unit, a chilling symbol of how quickly a routine task can become fatal. Glenn was arrested shortly thereafter, without resistance. He was found to be in possession of the weapon used in the shooting and showed no signs of remorse in the immediate aftermath. Authorities quickly moved to secure the area and interview witnesses. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices followed by multiple gunshots. Many described Staley as a fair and respectful property manager, a professional who had never displayed aggression and was generally liked by tenants. The sudden and violent nature of his death shocked the community and prompted immediate calls for justice. In the hours that followed, police pieced together the timeline of events. Surveillance footage, text messages, and landlord-tenant communications all painted a picture of escalating tension. Glenn, who had previously filed baseless complaints against Staley, had a documented pattern of confrontational behavior. His refusal to comply with legal eviction procedures, coupled with his volatile temperament, had created a powder keg waiting to explode. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a voicemail left by Glenn weeks before the incident, in which he threatened to handle things his own way if forced to move. Prosecutors later described this message as premeditative and critical to establishing intent. The broader implications of the murder began to unfold. Property managers across the state spoke out, emphasizing the dangers of their line of work and the need for legal protections. Many called for stricter penalties against tenants who threaten violence, while others advocated for additional training and support for individuals tasked with enforcing housing laws. For Chad Staley's family, the loss was incalculable. A father, a husband, and a dedicated professional was taken from them in an act of senseless violence. Memorials sprang up in Anchorage, with tenants leaving flowers and messages at the complex where he was killed. His colleagues, visibly shaken, vowed to continue his work but admitted to feeling fear in performing routine duties. As Glenn awaited trial, questions lingered. How could this have been prevented? Were there warning signs? Could law enforcement have acted sooner? The answers were not immediately clear. What was certain, however, was that a community had lost a respected figure to an act of brutality rooted not in necessity, but in rage. The courtroom would soon become the next battleground, as prosecutors prepared to present a compelling case of premeditated murder. But before justice could be served, the full story of what led to Chad Staley's death needed to be told. A story of duty met with defiance, of legal authority challenged by violent resistance, and of a tragedy that might have been avoided if warning signs had not been ignored. The courtroom in Anchorage was filled with tension as the trial of Mitchell Glenn began. This was no ordinary murder case. It had ignited deep emotions in a community grappling with the violent loss of a man many knew and respected. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out its theory that the murder of Chad Staley was not a spontaneous act, but a calculated killing rooted in resentment and defiance. Prosecutor Emily Ward opened with a chilling narrative. She described Glenn as a man who refused to accept legal authority, who lashed out when challenged, and who saw the eviction process as a personal attack. This was not self-defense, she stated firmly. This was an ambush. The defendant knew what he was doing. He planned it. He executed it. The state's evidence was extensive. The centerpiece was the surveillance video from a neighbor's security camera. It showed Glenn exiting the apartment with a gun, confronting Staley, and firing multiple times with little to no warning. The footage stunned the courtroom. Some members of the audience audibly gasped as the shots rang out on screen. The prosecution argued that this video alone confirmed the deliberate nature of the crime. Testimony from Chad Staley's colleague, who was present during the shooting, painted a similarly grim picture. Visibly shaken, he described the events in detail, how Chad had knocked on the door calmly, how Glenn had emerged in a fury, and how he pulled the gun and fired with precision. There was no struggle, no provocation, he said. Chad didn't even raise his voice. The prosecution also introduced a damning voicemail Glenn had left for a friend, just days before the shooting, in which he said, "If they come back, I'm not backing down. I'll take care of it myself." This statement, according to the state, confirmed Glenn's premeditated intent. To strengthen their case, prosecutors called on a forensic pathologist who confirmed that Staley had been shot 4 times, including once in the chest at close range, a detail that suggested Glenn was intent on ensuring his death. Ballistics experts verified that the weapon found in Glenn's possession matched the bullets recovered from the scene. The defense, led by attorney Michael Foster, faced an uphill battle. From the beginning, Foster did not deny that Glenn had pulled the trigger. Instead, he framed the act as one of desperation, the result of escalating pressure and fear of being forced into homelessness. "My client was backed into a corner," he said. He felt targeted, unheard, and terrified of losing everything. He reacted not out of malice, but panic. Foster introduced testimony from a psychologist who had evaluated Glenn and diagnosed him with generalized anxiety disorder and paranoid tendencies. The psychologist testified that Glenn's perception of the situation may have been distorted by his mental health struggles. In his mind, this wasn't a routine eviction, the doctor said. It was a threat to his survival. But under cross-examination, the prosecution dismantled this line of defense. They pointed out that Glenn had remained lucid and composed after the shooting, making no attempt to flee or call for help. Instead, he waited for police and calmly surrendered. "That is not the behavior of a man in crisis," Prosecutor Ward said. "That is the behavior of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was prepared for the consequences." Witnesses from the apartment complex further testified that Glenn had a reputation for being confrontational. Several tenants reported previous incidents in which he threatened neighbors and made angry outbursts over perceived slights. One former neighbor recounted how Glenn once threatened to break a maintenance worker's nose for entering his unit with notice. The trial lasted nearly 2 weeks. As each day passed, the emotional toll on the Staley family became more apparent. Chad's widow sat quietly in the front row, her eyes never leaving the witness stand. She spoke briefly in court, offering a victim impact statement that brought many to tears. "My husband was a good man," she said. "He didn't deserve this. He went to work that day just trying to do his job. He never came home." The jury deliberated for less than a day. When the verdict was read, guilty of first-degree murder, a collective breath left the courtroom. Glenn showed no reaction. He remained seated, staring ahead, his face unreadable. The judge scheduled sentencing for a later date, but made a preliminary remark. "This court has heard no justification that would excuse such a cold and calculated act. This was a deliberate murder of a man simply doing his job." The case quickly made headlines across the state and drew national attention as a chilling example of how a legal dispute can erupt into fatal violence. It raised questions about the safety of housing professionals, the impact of untreated mental illness, and the need for early intervention in volatile landlord-tenant relationships. But for the Staley family, no verdict could undo the pain. The trial may have concluded, but the wound remained open. Justice, though served, was a bittersweet consolation for a loss that could never be fully repaired. On a somber day in Anchorage Superior Court, the final chapter of the Mitchell-Glenn case came to a close. Judge Rachel McMahon, seated high on the bench, addressed a packed courtroom as she prepared to sentence the man found guilty of the first-degree murder of Housing Authority employee Chad Staley. The air was thick with emotion, the gravity of the moment reflected in the silence that blanketed the room. "Mitchell-Glenn," the judge began, her voice steady but firm, "you took the life of a man who represented no threat to you. He was unarmed, conducting lawful duties. You acted not in defense, but in vengeance. This court sentences you to 99 years in prison with no eligibility for parole for at least 40 years. Gasps and quiet sobs rippled through the gallery. For the Staley family, this was the conclusion they had hoped for. Though it brought no comfort, no reversal of the tragedy that had destroyed their world. Chad's widow, holding a framed photo of her husband, wept silently. She later told reporters that the sentence was just, but admitted that justice doesn't bring Chad back. During the sentencing phase, the court heard more about Glenn's background. He had no prior violent criminal record. In fact, neighbors described him as an intelligent but isolated man, often withdrawn, increasingly erratic over the years. His paranoia about authority figures, landlords, housing officials, and even postal workers had intensified, yet no one had anticipated that it could culminate in deadly violence. Psychological evaluations presented during the trial indicated a deep-rooted fear of institutional power, fed by unresolved trauma and untreated mental illness. But despite these factors, the court ruled that Glenn was legally sane at the time of the crime and fully aware of the consequences of his actions. The case sparked widespread debate throughout Alaska and beyond. Housing authorities across the country took notice. New protocols were reviewed and in some cases implemented. Some departments began requiring security escorts for employees delivering eviction notices. Others instituted training for recognizing potential threats from tenants exhibiting hostile or unstable behavior. Advocacy groups also used the case to highlight gaps in mental health services, especially for individuals living in isolated, low-income housing. A local nonprofit, the Anchorage Mental Wellness Initiative, released a report shortly after the verdict, stating that This tragedy underscores how mental health neglect in housing communities can turn systemic failure into irreversible human loss. Chad Staley was remembered not only as a devoted husband and father, but as a dedicated public servant. His funeral drew hundreds of people, colleagues, friends, and strangers alike, who came to honor a man whose only crime was doing his job. A scholarship was later established in his name to support students pursuing careers in social work and housing assistance. Meanwhile, Mitchell Glenn began serving his sentence at Spring Creek Correctional Center. Isolated from the world he once saw as hostile and threatening, he is now confined by the consequences of his own actions, a grim reflection of the paranoia that once defined his life. For the Staley family, the road to healing is long. In public statements, they've spoken of the importance of remembering Chad, not for the way he died, but for the life he lived, compassionate, responsible, and committed to helping others. They have since become vocal advocates for housing safety reforms, turning their pain into purpose. The story of this case, now etched into Alaska's legal history, continues to resonate. It serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile the line can be between civil conflict and lethal violence. It shows how systems designed to serve the public, such as housing, can become battlefields when trust, communication, and mental wellness are lost. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges society to confront uncomfortable truths, that ordinary people in everyday roles can be placed in danger without warning, that institutions must do more to protect both staff and residents, and that unresolved anger left to fester can ignite into unspeakable tragedy. As journalists, we chronicle these moments, not only to recount what happened, but to warn of what can happen again. The death of Chad Staley, at the hands of a man once seen as simply another tenant, is a story that lingers long after the gavel falls.